The blizzard that changed everything came down off the Bighorn Mountains on the second night of December, 1885, and it was Ada Donnelly's own stubbornness that put her out in it, searching for a lost calf, when she found the enemy's son half buried in a snowdrift instead. She had ridden out from the Donnelly ranch house alone, against her father's wishes, because a good milk cow had wandered from the herd near Willow Creek, and Ada could not stomach the thought of losing an animal to the cold when a little riding might save it. The wind had teeth that night. It came down through the pines with a sound like a woman screaming, and the snow fell so thick and so fast that Ada lost sight of her own lantern light within 20 feet. She had almost turned back, had almost let good sense win over pride, when her horse shied and nearly threw her, and she saw why. A boy lay curled against the base of a cottonwood tree, his coat crusted white, his lips a shade of blue that made Ada's stomach drop clean through the saddle. She was down off her horse before she had time to think about who he might belong to, her hands already working at the buttons of her own coat to press warmth into him, and it was only when she turned his face up toward her lantern that she recognized him. It was Warren Dawson's boy. Tommy Dawson, 9 years old, son of the man whose cattle had grazed illegally on Donnelly water for 3 summers running, whose hired hands had cut Donnelly fences twice that Ada knew of, whose name her father spat like a curse at the supper table more nights than not. The Dawson and Donnelly ranches had been at war, in the quiet, grinding way that ranches warred in the Wyoming territory, since before Ada was old enough to understand why. Cattle disappeared. Fences came down in the night. Once, 3 years back, a Dawson hand and a Donnelly hand had traded gunfire over a stretch of disputed grazing land, and though no one had died, the wound in that man's shoulder had never quite healed the way the wound between the two families had never healed either. And here was Warren Dawson's only son, freezing to death in a snowbank that belonged, by every surveyor's map and every bitter word her father had ever spoken, to Donnelly land. Ada did not hesitate more than a heartbeat. She was a rancher's daughter, not a fool, and she understood well enough that a body left in that cold past another hour would not see morning. She hauled the boy up onto her horse in front of her, wrapped her own coat around him twice, and turned back toward home at a pace that near killed her mare climbing through the drifts. Her father met her on the porch with a rifle across his arm, because in that country a rider coming hard out of a blizzard at midnight was as likely to be trouble as not, and when he saw what she carried his face went through surprise, and then fury, faster than Ada had ever seen a man's face move. "Get that boy off my land," Patrick Donnelly said, and his voice was low and flat in the way that Ada had learned since childhood was more dangerous than shouting. "He'll die, Pa. Let the Dawsons bury their own dead. God knows they've helped bury enough of ours in spirit if not in fact. He is 9 years old." Ada did not raise her voice either. She had learned that from her father too, the trick of standing quiet and immovable as a fence post when her mind was made up, and her mind was made up now with a certainty that surprised even her. "I am taking him inside, Pa. You can stand there with that rifle all night if you like, but I am taking him inside, and if you want to shoot me to stop it, you had best load faster than you're thinking because I am already walking." She walked past him into the house, and after a long moment she heard the door close behind her, and no shot came, and that was the whole of it. Patrick Donnelly did not help her carry the boy to the spare room, and he did not speak another word to her that night, but neither did he stop her, and in the years after Ada would come to understand that this, too, had been its own kind of grace, wrung out of a man who did not have much of it left to give where the Dawsons were concerned. The boy's fever set in by morning, a rattling, dangerous heat that made him thrash and mutter names Ada did not know. She sat beside him through that first day and the night that followed, spooning broth between his cracked lips, wringing cloths in cold water to lay across his brow, and praying in the plain, unadorned way of a woman raised on a hard ranch who did not have much time for church, but had never lost her belief in something larger than herself. It was on the third day, with the storm finally blown out, and the sky over the Bighorn scrubbed a pale and merciless blue, that Warren Dawson came riding up the frozen lane to the Donnelly ranch house with 6 of his hands behind him and murder plain on his face. Ada heard the horses before she saw them, and she was out on the porch with her shawl clutched at her throat before her father could reach the door, because she understood in her bones what was happening even before Warren Dawson swung down from his horse in the yard. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had spent 20 years wrestling cattle and fence posts, with a dark beard going gray at the edges, and eyes the color of a Wyoming sky before a storm, gray-blue and unsettled. Ada had seen him from a distance at the county fair once, years back, before the worst of the trouble started, and she remembered thinking even then that he carried himself like a man who had buried something and never quite finished grieving it. Now his face was carved from stone, and his hand was near his sidearm, and behind him his men sat their horses with rifles resting easy across their saddles. "Where is my boy?" Warren Dawson said. It was not a question. "He is inside," Ada said, "and he is alive, which is more than he would be if I had left him where I found him, half buried in a drift on my father's land, 3 miles from your house, in a storm that killed 2 head of my father's own cattle that same night." Something in Warren's face flinched at that, some crack in the stone, though his jaw stayed hard. "You will bring him out to me now." "He has a fever of 103 degrees and pneumonia setting into his chest," Ada said, and she did not move from the porch step. "If you put that boy on a horse and ride him 3 miles home in this cold, Mr. Dawson, you will bury him before the week is out, and I do not believe that is what you rode over here to do." Behind Ada, her father had come to stand in the doorway, and for a moment the 2 men, Patrick Donnelly and Warren Dawson, simply looked at each other across the frozen yard with a decade of bad blood sitting heavy between them. It was Patrick who spoke first, and his voice was rough with things he did not want to be saying. "My daughter is right, Dawson, much as it pains me to say a kind word in your direction. The boy stays until the fever breaks. You are welcome to sit with him if that eases your mind, but you are not moving him." Warren Dawson looked at Ada for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that she could not name yet, though she would come to know it well before that winter was through. Fear, she thought later. Not of her, not of her father, but of the plain fact that his son might die and there was nothing his anger or his cattle or his 6 armed men could do about it. "I will stay," Warren said finally, "until he is well. And Donnelly, I am obliged to you, whatever else stands between us." "Do not thank me," Patrick said. "Thank my daughter. It was her foolishness that found him and her foolishness that will nurse him, and I want no part of the credit nor, if I am honest, any part of your company in my house longer than it takes that boy to mend." It was not gracious, but it was enough, and Warren Dawson sent his men home with instructions to see to the ranch, and he himself walked into the house of his enemy and did not walk back out for 11 weeks. The spare room where Tommy Dawson lay became, in the days that followed, a strange and quiet battleground of its own, though the only weapons wielded there were cool cloths and spoonfuls of broth, and the low murmur of a mother's songs that Ada found herself humming without quite meaning to. The same ones her own mother had sung to her before consumption took her when Ada was 12. Warren sat on the opposite side of the bed most hours, his big hands looking strange and useless against the small quilted counterpane, and for the first 2 days he and Ada barely spoke beyond what the boy's care required. "You will need to prop him higher," Ada said on the second night, when Tommy's breathing had gone rattling and shallow. "The doctor in town, when he was through here in October, told me a case like this eases better with the chest raised. Fetch that other pillow." Warren fetched it without argument, and their hands brushed as they eased Tommy up against the bolster, and Ada felt something she did not want to feel, a small warm shock that ran clean up her arm, and she told herself firmly it was nothing but tiredness and the strange intimacy that illness forces between strangers. Doc Hobbs rode out from Buffalo 2 days later, summoned by one of the Donnelly hands, and he confirmed what Ada already suspected. Pneumonia, settled deep in both lungs, made worse by the hours the boy had lain in the cold before Ada found him. The doctor left a bottle of expectorant and instructions that amounted to little more than what Ada was already doing. Keep him warm. Keep him fed on broth and milk when he would take it. Keep the room free of drafts and wait. Waiting, Doc Hobbs said as he packed his bag, is the hardest medicine there is, Mr. Dawson, and I'm afraid it is the only one I have got for you. Warren Dawson was not a man built for waiting. Ada learned that about him quickly, in the way he paced the narrow hallway outside the spare room at all hours, in the way his big hands clenched and unclenched when Tommy's fever spiked past 104 on the 5th night, and the boy began to speak in a fevered rush about his mother, dead now 3 years, calling for her in a small broken voice that made even Patrick Donnelly, listening from the kitchen, go still and quiet at his own table. He does not remember her much, Warren said that night low to Ada as they sat on either side of the bed in the lamplight. He was 6 when she passed, but the fever brings her up out of him somehow. I do not understand it. Fever brings up what is buried deepest, Ada said. My mother has been gone 11 years, and when I had the grip 2 winters back I called for her the whole night through, so my father told me after. There are some griefs that do not heal so much as they wait. Warren looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made Ada's face warm despite the cold night air seeping through the window frame. You lost your mother young too, then. 12 years old. Consumption. Ada wrung out the cloth and laid it across Tommy's brow, gentle as she could manage, and did not look up. It is why I could not leave your boy in that drift, Mr. Dawson, whatever my father might have preferred. I know what it is to nearly not have a mother's care, and I could not stomach the thought of a boy losing his chance at growing up entire, over a fence line in some bad blood that is none of his making. Warren, he said, beg pardon. My name, it is Warren. If we are to sit up nights together over my son's sickbed, I would as soon not be Mr. Dawson to you the whole while. It sits strange, given the circumstance. Ada allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first she had managed in days. Warren, then, and I am Ada. I know your name, Warren said quietly. I have known it a long while, though I confess I did not think until 3 nights ago that I would ever have cause to be glad of it. It was a small thing, the trading of first names over a sick child's bed, but Ada would think of it later as the true beginning, the moment the war between their 2 families had begun, without either of them quite noticing to end. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended rhythm, the household organizing itself around the sick room the way a wagon train organizes itself around a broken wheel. Ada's father kept mostly to the far side of the house and to his own hands company, though Ada noticed him standing once in the hallway outside the spare room, listening to Tommy's ragged breathing with an expression on his weathered face that she could not quite read, something between old grief and a grudging, unwilling softness. He had lost a son of his own, Ada's older brother, to a fever not unlike this one when Ada herself was only 4. A fact rarely spoken of in the Donnelly house but never far from the surface of her father's temper, and Ada wondered if that old wound was not part of what kept his rifle silent and his hospitality, however grudging, extended. Warren took to helping with the ranch chores in the mornings when Tommy's fever allowed him an hour's rest from the bedside, first hesitantly, then with the easy competence of a man who had worked cattle his whole life, and Ada noticed her father watching him muck out the stalls or mend a length of harness with the same grudging, unwilling attention he paid the sick-room door. Neither man spoke much to the other, but the silence between them, Ada thought, had a different quality now than it once had. Less like a held breath before a blow, and more like 2 men too tired and too worried to keep fighting a fight that had, for the moment, lost its urgency next to a child's labored breathing. It was on the 9th night, the worst of them, that the fever broke. Ada had not left the room in nearly 2 days by then, catching what sleep she could in the chair by the window, and Warren had taken to sitting on the floor with his back against the wall when his legs gave out from standing, too proud or too worried to leave even for a proper rest. Near 3 in the morning, Tommy's small body, which had been rigid and burning for hours, suddenly went slack, and a sweat broke out across his brow that soaked clean through the bedclothes, and for one terrible moment Ada's heart seized with the fear that they had lost him. Ada. Warren's voice cracked on her name, rough with a fear she had not heard in him before, not even on that first day in the yard with his men and his rifle. Ada, what is happening? Tell me what is happening to him. Ada pressed her fingers to the boy's throat, to the thin, racing pulse there, and felt it slow, steady, strengthen, and she let out a breath she had not known she was holding. The fever has broken. Warren, look, feel here. She took his big, rough hand and pressed it, without thinking twice about the intimacy of the gesture, against his son's damp forehead. He is cooling. The crisis has passed. Warren Dawson, a man Ada had heard described by her own father as hard as flint and twice as cold, put his face down against his son's small hand and wept, silent and shaking, and Ada sat beside him in the lamplight and did not look away, because she understood that some things a person should not have to weep alone, and because somewhere in the last 9 days, without her quite giving herself leave to notice it happening, she had come to care very much whether this man wept alone or not. Tommy Dawson did not wake fully for another 2 days, but from that night the fever did not return, and the worst of the danger passed like a storm blown out to sea. Ada slept a full night for the first time in over a week, and woke to find Warren sitting at the kitchen table with her father, the two of them not speaking, but sharing a pot of coffee in a silence that had at last lost some of its old venom. The boy's recovery, once begun, moved slowly but surely, the way recoveries from serious illness do, 2 steps forward and 1 step back, a good day followed by a tired and fretful one, an appetite that returned in fits and starts. It was during this long convalescence, through the heart of that hard Wyoming winter, that Ada Donnelly and Warren Dawson truly came to know one another, in the small, ordinary ways that build something lasting far better than any grand gesture could. Tommy, once well enough to sit up and take an interest in his surroundings, proved to be a bright, curious boy, quick with questions and quicker still with a laugh once he found his strength again, and Ada found herself drawn to him in a way that went beyond simple nursing duty. She read to him from the few books the Donnelly house possessed, an old worn copy of Robinson Crusoe and a Bible with cracked binding, and taught him to whittle a small horse from a block of soft pine with a penknife when his hands grew steady enough to hold one, and listened to him talk, in the unguarded way of children, about his mother, about the ranch he missed, about a dog named Scout that Warren had left in the care of a hand back home. "Pa does not laugh much," Tommy told her one afternoon as she helped him work the whittling knife along the pine block, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. "He used to, Ma said before, but not since." "Grief does that to a person," Ada said. "It is not that the laughing is gone forever, Tommy, only that it takes time to find its way back out." "Has he laughed since he has been here?" Ada considered the question honestly. "Once or twice. When you told him that joke about the mule and the preacher 2 days back, I heard him from the hallway." Tommy grinned, pleased with himself, and went back to his whittling, and Ada found herself smiling too, thinking of the sound of Warren Dawson's laugh, low and rusty like a gate that had not swung in a long while, and how much she wanted to hear it again. It was in the evenings, after Tommy had been settled for the night, that Ada and Warren found themselves falling into the habit of sitting together by the kitchen fire, her father having taken to retiring early. Whether from genuine tiredness or a deliberate granting of privacy, Ada was never quite certain. They talked at first haltingly, then with a growing ease about small things, the weather, the price of cattle, and then gradually about larger ones. "My wife's name was Sarah," Warren told her one such evening, staring into the fire with the particular stillness of a man revisiting an old wound to see if it still ached the same. She had a laugh that carried clean across the yard. I used to be able to tell what mood the whole ranch was in just by whether I could hear her laughing from the barn. He paused, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. She died bringing our second child into the world. Girl. She did not live either, the baby. That was 3 years back this coming spring. I am sorry, Warren. I know you are. I did not think I would believe that coming from a Donnelly, but I find I do. He looked up at her then, and the firelight caught something raw and unguarded in his gray-blue eyes. That is the year the trouble between our ranches got bad in earnest, you know, after Sarah passed. I do not say that as excuse, only as fact. A man who has lost the thing he loved most does not handle small slights the way he ought to. Your father's fence coming up on that north pasture, I took it personal in a way I might not have before. I let a grievance that should have stayed a grievance turn into something meaner. Ada considered this, turning her own cup in her hands, and found that she believed him, and found too that the belief loosened something tight in her own chest that she had not known was wound so hard. My father lost my brother the same year my mother died of consumption, near enough. 2 griefs stacked one on the other, and no one left to share the weight but a girl of 12. I think he has been angry at the world in a general sort of way ever since, and your ranch simply happened to be standing closest when the anger needed somewhere to land. 2 wounded men, Warren said quietly, taking turns tearing at each other because it was easier than sitting still with the actual hurt. Something like that. They sat with that thought a long moment, the fire cracking softly, and then Warren said, in a voice gone rougher than before, I do not know how to thank you properly, Ada Donnelly, for what you have done for my boy. There are not words big enough. You do not need to thank me, Ada said. I did what any decent person would do, finding a child freezing in the snow. Not any decent person would have fought her own father over it. Not any decent person would have sat up 11 nights running at the bedside of her family's enemy, feeding him broth and singing him to sleep like her own. I heard you, you know, singing to him, twice at least when the fever was at its worst. Ada felt her face heat, embarrassed to have been caught at something so private, and covered it by busying herself refilling her coffee cup. My mother used to sing that same song to me. I do not even recall learning it, only that it was always there. It was a good thing to hear, Warren said. I have not heard singing in that house in 3 years. Something passed between them then, unspoken but unmistakable, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and Ada found herself unable to meet his eyes for a long moment, her heart beating strangely fast in her chest. The winter deepened around them, the snow piling in drifts against the fence lines, the cattle huddling in the lee of the barn, and the household at the Donnelly ranch settled into an uneasy but functioning peace. Word of the arrangement had, of course, spread through the county, as such things always did, and not everyone received it kindly. There were men on both sides, Donnelly hands and Dawson hands alike, who had nursed their own grievances too long to let them go easily simply, because their employers had struck an uneasy truce over a sick child. It was in late January that the trouble Ada had half expected finally came to a head. She had ridden into the small town of Buffalo with her father for supplies, the first trip either of them had made in weeks, and it was there, outside the general store, that she overheard 2 men talking low and ugly by the hitching post, men she recognized as Dawson hands, though not among the 6 who had ridden out that first terrible morning. Old man Dawson has gone soft, sitting up in the enemy's house like some tame dog, one of them said, a lean man with a scarred lip named Coyle whom Ada had never liked the look of. First chance I get, I mean to remind him whose side he is meant to be standing on. There is grazing land at stake here, and cattle that have gone missing these 3 winters that I would lay good money the Donnellys had a hand in, whatever soft words are being traded over that boy's sickbed. Careful, the other man said. Boss finds out you are talking that way, he will have your hide. Boss is not thinking straight these days, Coyle said. Somebody has got to. Ada said nothing to the men, but she rode home with a cold knot of worry sitting low in her stomach. And that night, once Tommy was asleep, she told Warren what she had overheard. Warren's face darkened, the old hardness she remembered from that first morning in the yard flickering briefly back across his features. Coyle has been trouble a long while. I kept him on because he is a good hand with the branding. God forgive me for weighing that against his temper. I will speak to him. Warren. Ada put a hand on his arm, and he went still beneath her touch. Be careful how you speak to him. A man who talks that free about missing cattle and old grievances in a public street is not a man who takes correction easily, and I would not have you ride into more trouble on my account, nor on Tommy's. I have to go back soon, Ada, Warren said, and there was a weight in the words that told her he had been turning this thought over for some time. Tommy is nearly well. Another week, perhaps two, and Doc Hobbs will clear him to travel. I cannot keep the ranch running from your father's kitchen table forever, whatever debt of gratitude I owe this house. I know, Ada said, and found the words harder to say than she had expected, a small ache opening in her chest at the thought of the house going quiet again, of Tommy's laugh no longer echoing down the hallway, of evenings by the fire without Warren's low voice beside her. I know you must go back. Warren looked at her a long moment, and something in his gray-blue eyes seemed to war with itself before he spoke again, quieter now, almost hesitant in a way that did not suit a man his size and bearing. I do not want to go back to a world where you and I are enemies again, Ada. I do not think I could stomach it after this winter, after all you have done, after all I have. He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words, then pressed on with the plain honesty of a man who had run out of patience for careful speech. After all I have come to feel for you, sitting in this house these past weeks. Ada's breath caught. Warren, I know it is not simple. I know there is a decade of bad blood between our families that does not wash away because one boy near died and one woman had the courage and the kindness to save him. I know your father would sooner see me ridden out of the county than sitting at his table courting his daughter. But I am done pretending I do not feel what I feel, Ada Donnelly, and I would rather say it plain and be turned away than carry it home unspoken, and let it eat at me the way the grief over Sarah ate at me for 3 years. Ada looked at this big, weathered man, who had wept silently over his son's fevered hand and laughed rusty and low at a boy's joke about a mule and a preacher, who had mucked out stalls without complaint and mended harness, and sat up through 9 terrible nights without once raising his voice or his hand in the anger she had always been told to expect from a Dawson. And she found that whatever careful walls she had built around her own heart these past weeks had already, quietly, come tumbling down. I do not want to go back to being enemies either, she said softly. I have not wanted that in some time now, if I am honest with myself, though I have been slow to admit it, even to myself. Warren reached out then and took her hand, his own rough and calloused from a lifetime of ranch work, and Ada let him, felt the warmth of it travel clean up her arm the same as it had that first night by Tommy's bedside, except now she understood exactly what the feeling meant and did not try to talk herself out of it. I would like to court you properly, Warren said, if you will permit it. Not in secret, not sneaking about like something shameful, but out in the open, whatever trouble it stirs up. I am done hiding things that matter, Ada. I lost 3 years of my son's laughter to grief and pride, and I do not intend to lose whatever this is between us to the same foolishness. I would like that very much, Ada said, and when Warren leaned down and pressed his lips to the back of her hand, gentle and reverent as a man handling something precious and unexpected, Ada felt the warmth of it settle deep into her chest and stay there, a quiet, steady heat that felt nothing at all like the Cold War that had defined both their families for so long. They did not kiss that night, both of them too mindful of propriety and of the sleeping boy down the hall and the sleeping father across the house, but something had shifted, settled, become certain, and Ada went to her bed that night with her heart fuller than it had been in years. The trouble Ada had feared came, as trouble in that country so often did, without much warning and with considerably more danger than either of them had anticipated. It began 3 days later, when one of the Donnelly hands rode in at a hard gallop to report that a dozen head of cattle had gone missing from the north pasture overnight, the same pasture that bordered Dawson land, the same stretch of grazing that had caused so much friction over the years. Patrick Donnelly's face went thunderous at the news, old suspicions flaring up hot and immediate, and it took every ounce of Ada's persuasion and Warren's own steady insistence to keep him from riding straight for the Dawson ranch with his rifle across his saddle. "It is Coyle," Warren said grimly, once Patrick had been talked down enough to listen. "I would stake my life on it. He has been talking wild since before Christmas, and I have half suspected him of rustling before now, though I never could prove it. He means to force this trouble back open, Patrick, whether either of us wants it or not." "And why should I believe a word out of a Dawson mouth on the matter?" Patrick said, though the heat had gone out of his voice somewhat, replaced by a weary sort of doubt. "Because your daughter saved my son's life," Warren said, "and because I have sat at your table and eaten your bread for near 2 months now, and because whatever else stands between our families, I am not a man who repays a debt like that with a lie. Give me a day. Let me ride back to my own ranch and root this out myself. If I am wrong, and it was one of my own men behind it, I will bring you the proof and the man both, and you may deal with him as the law allows. If I am wrong the other direction, and it proves to be one of your hands after all trying to stir the pot from the Donnelly side, I will expect the same courtesy returned." Patrick studied him a long moment, and Ada watched her father's weathered face work through some private calculation that seemed to weigh not just the practical matter of the missing cattle, but the whole long history of grief and anger that had brought them all to this point. "One day," Patrick said finally. "You have 1 day, Dawson, and then I am riding out with every man I have got, and I will not answer for what happens after that." Warren rode out within the hour, and Ada, against both her father's wishes and her own better judgment, saddled her mare and rode with him, unwilling to let him face whatever waited at the Dawson ranch alone, and unwilling, too, though she did not say this part aloud, to sit at home wondering and worrying while the man she loved rode toward possible danger. "You should not have come," Warren said, though there was no real force behind the words, and Ada thought she caught something like gratitude beneath the surface of his protest. "You did not exactly forbid it," Ada pointed out, "and I have grown fairly accustomed these past weeks to going where I please regardless of what a Dawson thinks proper." Warren's mouth twitched, the rusty laugh she had come to love threatening to break through despite the tension of the ride. "That you have. God help me, Ada Donnelly, but I would not have you any other way." They found the trouble waiting for them in the Dawson ranch yard, exactly as Warren had feared. Coyle stood with 3 other hands near the barn, and behind them, in a makeshift pen that had clearly been thrown together in haste, stood a dozen head of cattle bearing the unmistakable Donnelly brand. "What is the meaning of this?" Warren said, swinging down from his horse with a fury Ada had not seen in him since that first morning in the Donnelly yard. Coyle did not look particularly repentant. If anything, there was a hard, satisfied glint in his eye, the look of a man who believed himself in the right and expected, eventually, to be proven so. "Meaning is plain enough, boss. I took what was owed us. Donnelly cattle have been grazing our water for years without so much as a thank you, and I figured it past time somebody balanced the scales." "You figured wrong," Warren said. "You have put a match to a powder keg, Coyle, and you did it on my land using my name without my knowledge or my leave. Did you think I would thank you for it?" "I thought you had gone soft," Coyle said, and there was real anger in it now, spilling out in front of the other hands. "Sitting up in that Donnelly kitchen for 2 months, letting that girl nurse feelings into you same as she nursed your boy. This war has gone on 10 years, boss, and we have lost good grazing and good water to Donnelly's stubbornness the whole while. And now You would just hand it all back over a pretty face and a debt of gratitude." Ada felt her own temper rise hot at that, but it was Warren who spoke first, and his voice, when it came, was low and dangerous in a way that made even Coyle take an involuntary step back. "You will not speak of Miss Donnelly that way again, not in my hearing, not anywhere within 100 miles of my hearing, or I will finish the conversation with my fists instead of my mouth. Do you understand me?" Coyle swallowed, some of the bravado draining out of him under the weight of Warren's stare, but he was not quite done. "And what about the war, boss? What about 10 years of grievance? You mean to just let that go because of a woman?" "I mean to end it," Warren said, "because it should have ended long before now, and because I have spent 3 years letting my own grief poison every decision I made about this ranch and this family, and I am done with it. You will return every one of those cattle to Donnelly land by sundown, Coyle, and you will do it yourself, and then you will collect your final wages and be gone from this ranch by morning. I will not have a thief in my employ, whatever grievance he believes justifies the theft." For a moment it seemed Coyle might argue further, might even reach for the pistol at his hip, and Ada's heart clenched with fear, but the other hand standing behind him, men who had perhaps been swept along by Coyle's talk more than truly committed to it, shifted uneasily, and whatever support Coyle had counted on visibly crumbled in the space of that silence. "Fine," Coyle said at last, spitting into the dirt at his feet. "Fine. Keep your soft ranch and your Donnelly sweetheart. I never wanted any part of a boss who forgets which side he is meant to stand on." He turned and stalked off toward the bunkhouse, and within the hour, true to Warren's word, he was gone from the Dawson ranch for good, riding south with whatever wages remained to his name, and none of the men following him. The cattle were returned to Donnelly land by sundown as promised, driven back across the disputed pasture by 2 chastened, quiet hands under Warren's own supervision. And when Warren rode up to the Donnelly ranch house afterward to report the matter settled, Patrick Donnelly met him on the porch with something in his weathered face that was not quite friendliness, but was, Ada thought, watching from the doorway, at least the beginning of respect. "You handled it fair," Patrick said, "fairer than I expected if I am honest." "It was fair handling that was owed," Warren said. "I should have rooted that man's trouble out months back, before it ever came to this. I am sorry it cost you a scare and near cost us all a war neither of our families can afford any more." Patrick studied him a long moment, and then, in a gesture that Ada would remember for the rest of her life as the true turning point of that long, hard winter, he extended his hand. 10 years is a long time to carry a grudge, Dawson. I find, watching you these past weeks, that I am tired of the weight of it. Perhaps it is past time we set it down." Warren shook his hand, firm and solemn, and something in the yard seemed to loosen. Some old tension that had hung over both families for a decade finally beginning, at last, to dissolve. It was 2 weeks later, on a bright cold morning in mid-February, that Doc Hobbs rode out one final time to examine Tommy Dawson and pronounced him fully recovered, fit to travel, fit to go home to his own bed and his own dog Scout. And the news, which should have been nothing but joyful, brought with it a bittersweet ache that Ada had not fully anticipated. "I do not want to go," Tommy announced at breakfast that morning, with the blunt honesty of a child who had not yet learned to soften difficult truths. "I like it here, I like Ada, and I like the horse she is teaching me to whittle, and I have not finished it yet." "We can finish the horse before you go," Ada said, though her own throat felt tight at the thought of the boy's absence, at the thought of the quiet house without his questions and his laughter to fill it. "And you are only a few miles distant now, Tommy, not clear across the county. You may visit as often as your father allows." "May I, Pa?" Tommy turned hopeful eyes on Warren, who sat across the table looking, Ada thought, nearly as reluctant as his son to have this strange, transformative winter come to its natural end. "We shall see," Warren said, though there was a warmth in his voice that suggested the answer, when it came, would be a generous one. They left that afternoon, Warren riding alongside Tommy on a gentle mare borrowed from the Donnelly stable, the boy still not quite strong enough for a full day in the saddle, and Ada stood on the porch and watched them go with an ache in her chest that surprised her with its depth. She had known, she told herself, that this arrangement could not last forever, that the boy belonged in his own home and Warren belonged running his own ranch. And yet the house felt suddenly, unbearably empty, once the sound of their horses' hooves had faded down the frozen lane. But Warren Dawson was, as he had promised her, a man done with hiding what mattered, and he did not let more than 3 days pass before he rode back to the Donnelly ranch, this time alone, Tommy left in the capable care of the Dawson housekeeper, a widow named Mrs. Prout, who had kept the boy's meals and his manners in order through the years since Sarah's death. "I have come to court you properly," Warren announced to Patrick Donnelly on the porch, with the same blunt directness his son had shown at the breakfast table days before, "if you will permit it, and if Ada will have me, which I hope she will, though I make no assumptions on that score." Patrick looked between the two of them, Ada standing in the doorway with her heart in her throat, Warren standing hat in hand in the yard like a much younger man come courting for the first time, and something that might almost have been a smile tugged at the corner of the old rancher's mouth. "Well," Patrick said, "I suppose after everything this winter has thrown at us, I would be a fool to stand in the way of it now. Come in, Dawson, before you let all the warm air out of my house standing there with the door open." And so began, in earnest, the courtship of Ada Donnelly and Warren Dawson, conducted in the full and open view of a county that had spent 10 years watching their families feud, and that now watched, with no small amount of gossip and speculation, as the daughter of one ranch and the widowed master of the other rode out together of a Sunday afternoon, or sat together at the small Buffalo church that both families, somewhat awkwardly, began attending on the same mornings. Not everyone in the county greeted the change with unmixed goodwill. There were old grudges among the hands of both ranches that did not vanish overnight simply because their employers had found peace, and there was a fair amount of gossip at the general store, and the feed lot about whether the Donnelly girl had lost her wits entirely, taking up with the very man whose cattle had grazed illegally on her father's water for years. But there was, too, a great deal of quiet relief among the more sensible members of the community, who had watched the slow bleed of the feud, the fences cut, the cattle lost, the occasional gunfire traded, and who understood better than most the cost such quarrels exacted on a hard country where neighbors needed each other to survive the winters and the droughts and the endless small disasters of frontier life. Sheriff Cole, who had ridden out more than once over the years to mediate some dispute or another between the two ranches, remarked to Patrick Donnelly one afternoon in town that he had never in 15 years of keeping the peace in that county seen a range war ended by a woman's kindness rather than a lawman's gun, and that he counted it, on the whole, a considerable improvement in method. Through that spring, as the snow melted off the bighorns and the first green came up tender and hopeful across the range, Ada and Warren's courtship deepened into something neither of them had any doubt was permanent. Tommy, fully recovered and full of the boundless energy of a healthy 9-year-old, took to riding over to the Donnelly ranch nearly every day that his lessons and his chores allowed, and it was not uncommon, by April, to find him underfoot in the Donnelly barn, learning to rope a fence post under the patient instruction of one of Ada's father's hands, or sitting at the kitchen table finishing, at long last, the small whittled horse that Ada had begun teaching him to carve back in January. It was on a warm evening in late April, with the smell of new grass drifting on the wind and the whole range washed gold in the setting sun, that Warren Dawson took Ada's hand as they walked the fence line between what had once been disputed Donnelly and Dawson grazing land, and asked her to marry him. "I have loved you, I think, since the 9th night," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he did not try to hide. "Since Tommy's fever broke and I put my face down against his hand, and you sat there beside me and did not look away, did not tell me to compose myself or mind my dignity, only let me weep like a man is allowed to weep sometimes. I have loved you every day since, more each week than the week before, and I do not want to spend one more day pretending otherwise. Ada Donnelly, will you marry me? Ada, standing in the golden light with the man who had once been her family's sworn enemy, felt no hesitation at all in her answer. Yes, Warren. Yes, I will marry you. I think I have loved you since that same night, if I am honest, though it took me a while longer to let myself believe it. He kissed her then, properly, for the first time, there on the fence line that had once divided their two families, and Ada thought, as his arms came around her, and the last of the sunset burned gold across the Wyoming range, that she had never in her life felt so certain of anything as she did of this. They were married in June, in the small church at Buffalo, with the whole county in attendance, Donnelly hands and Dawson hands sitting together in the same pews for the first time in a decade, an occurrence that Sheriff Cole remarked afterward was nearly as remarkable as the marriage itself. Patrick Donnelly walked his daughter down the aisle with tears standing openly in his eyes, and gave her hand to Warren Dawson with words that surprised the whole congregation with their warmth. "I lost a son once," Patrick said, his voice carrying clear through the small church, "to a fever not unlike the one that near took your boy, Dawson. And I let that grief curdle into anger that I aimed at you and your family for far longer than was fair or right. My daughter has taught me this winter that kindness accomplishes what anger never could. I am proud to call you son, and gladder than I can say to see this old feud laid to rest at last." Tommy stood at the front of the church as well, dressed in a small new suit that Ada suspected had cost Warren no small effort to get the boy to wear without complaint, beaming with the particular pride of a child who understood, in his own way, that he had been at the very center of this happy ending, that his own near death in a snowbank had somehow, impossibly, led to this moment of joy rather than the tragedy it might so easily have been. "You are going to be my mother now," he told Ada solemnly, after the ceremony, as the wedding party gathered in the churchyard for the small celebration that followed. "I have been thinking on it, and I have decided I am glad, though I suppose I should say I already thought of you that way from back in the winter." "I already thought of you as mine, too, Tommy," Ada said, kneeling to embrace him, her wedding dress pooling white against the churchyard grass. "From nearly the first night, if I am honest." The years that followed were not without their ordinary hardships, the kind every ranching family in that hard, beautiful country faced. Dry summers that stretched the grass thin, a bad winter in 1887, worse even than the one that had first brought Ada and Warren together, that cost both ranches cattle and tried the mettle of every family in the county, the small daily grind of frontier life that never entirely eased no matter how much love filled a household. But Ada and Warren faced these trials together, their combined ranches, merged in name and management within that first year of marriage under the simple sign that now read Dawson Donnelly Ranch, proving stronger and more resilient for the joining than either had been alone, sharing water rights and grazing land that had once been the very cause of a decade's bitter feud. Ada gave birth to their first child in the spring of 1887, a boy they named Patrick Warren Dawson, after both grandfathers, a fact that brought old Patrick Donnelly, by then thoroughly won over to his son-in-law and thoroughly besotted with his new grandson, to actual tears when Ada placed the infant in his weathered arms for the first time. Tommy, 12 years old that year and fiercely proud of his new baby brother, took to the role of elder sibling with an enthusiasm that occasionally required gentle correction, particularly regarding his conviction that a 2-month-old infant was ready to learn to ride. A daughter followed 2 years later, named Sarah after Warren's first wife, a gesture that Ada insisted upon over Warren's initial hesitation, understanding in her wise and generous heart that honoring the woman who had given Warren his first great love and his first son was not a threat to what she and Warren had built together. but rather a completion of it, an acknowledgement that love, properly understood, did not require the erasure of what came before it. "You are a remarkable woman, Ada Dawson," Warren told her, the night baby Sarah was born, holding his tiny daughter in the lamplight of their bedroom while Ada rested, exhausted and glowing against the pillows. "I do not know that I deserve the measure of grace you have shown this family. From that first night, you carried my son in out of a blizzard against your own father's rifle, straight through to this moment, naming our daughter for the wife I lost." "You deserve it," Ada said softly, "because you were willing to change, Warren. Because you let go of 10 years of grievance the moment it mattered more to hold onto your son's life than your family's pride. That is no small thing, and I have never once regretted loving you for it." By the time their third child arrived, another son they named Michael, born in the autumn of 1891, the old feud between the Donnelly and Dawson families had faded so thoroughly into county memory that the younger residents of Buffalo, Wyoming, hearing the old stories of cut fences and stolen cattle and near gunfights, found it almost impossible to believe such bitterness had ever existed between the same families who now ran the largest and most respected combined ranch in that stretch of the territory, a ranch known throughout the county not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the unusual harmony with which its two founding families, once bitter enemies, had come together. Tommy Dawson grew into a fine young man under the combined guidance of his father and his stepmother, working the ranch through his teenage years with the same steady competence Warren had shown, and eventually, at the age of 22, marrying a young woman from a neighboring ranch, a union that Ada attended with tears of joy, remembering the small fevered boy she had once nursed through 11 long weeks of a Wyoming winter, and marveling at the grown man he had become. Old Patrick Donnelly lived to see all three of Ada and Warren's children grow past their toddling years, a source of endless joy to a man who had spent so much of his middle life mired in grief and grievance. And when he passed peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1897, it was with his grandchildren gathered close and his daughter's hand in his, and his last words, Ada would tell her own children in the years that followed, had been words of gratitude. That he had lived long enough to see the feud that had defined so much of his life transformed into the greatest happiness he had ever known. Warren Dawson, for his part, never did entirely lose the rusty, unused quality to his laugh, the legacy of those 3 grieving years before Ada came into his life, but it grew easier and more frequent with every passing season, until by the time their 4th and final child, a girl named Grace, was born in 1894, Ada could not recall the last time a week had passed in their household without the sound of Warren's genuine, easy laughter ringing through the ranch house, usually provoked by some antic of one of the children, or some small tender joke shared between husband and wife in the quiet of an evening. On the anniversary of that terrible blizzard each December, Ada and Warren made a habit, through all the years of their marriage, of telling their children the story of the night that had brought their family together, the story of a boy found half frozen in a snowdrift, of a fever that had raged for 9 terrible nights, of a father's rifle that had not, in the end, been fired, of a war between 2 families that had been ended not by any treaty or any show of force, but by a woman's stubborn, unwavering kindness in the face of a decade's bitterness. "Your mother," Warren would tell the children, every year with the same warm pride in his voice, "walked past my rifle-toting men and her own father's rifle both, carrying my son wrapped in her own coat, because she could not bear to see a child die over a grudge that was none of his making. That is the woman I married. That is the kind of courage I hope every one of you carries in your own hearts, whatever storms you face in your own lives." And Ada, listening to her husband tell their shared story year after year, watching their children's faces light with the wonder of it, the near miraculous transformation of enmity into love, would feel, each time, the same swell of gratitude she had felt that first 9th night, watching Warren Dawson weep silently over his son's small hand, understanding even then, though she would not have said it aloud for weeks yet, that she had found in that sick room not an enemy's son to nurse back to health, but the beginning of the great and abiding love of her own life. The Dawson-Donnelly ranch prospered through the years that followed, weathering the hard winters and dry summers that tested every ranching family in that beautiful, unforgiving country. And when Ada and Warren celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary in the summer of 1906, surrounded by 4 grown and nearly grown children, several grandchildren already toddling about the yard, and the whole county gathered to celebrate a marriage that had, in the end, healed far more than a single family's grief. Warren stood to make a toast that Ada would remember and treasure for the rest of her days. 20 years ago this coming December, Warren said, raising his glass in the warm evening light, his voice carrying the particular emotion of a man who had, against all early expectation, found in his life's greatest tragedy the seed of his life's greatest joy. I rode onto Donnelly land with 6 armed men and murder in my heart, believing that woman standing beside me now to be my family's enemy. I was wrong about a great many things that winter, but I have never in the 20 years since been more grateful to have been proven wrong about anything. Ada Dawson saved my son's life with her own 2 hands and 11 weeks of sleepless devotion, and in doing so, she saved something in me I did not even know was dying. She ended a war that had cost both our families more than either of us wanted to admit, not with force, and not with clever argument, but simply by refusing to let hatred win out over kindness when it mattered most. I have loved her every single day since, and I intend to keep loving her every day I have left. To my wife, to the woman who nursed her enemy's son through the winter and gave me, in return, the rest of my life's happiness. Ada, tears standing bright in her eyes, rose and kissed her husband in front of the whole gathered county, and thought, as she had thought so many times over the years since that terrible, transformative blizzard, that she would not have traded a single moment of that hard winter, not the fear, not the exhaustion, not the danger of her father's rifle or Warren's armed men, for anything in the world, because it had led her, in the end, exactly where she was always meant to be.